So I guess Scott Peck is right in his book, The Road Less Traveled. Life is tough. There's just hard things that happen. Hurts and heartaches and disappointments. We just shared a tip of the iceberg. I suppose if we went down row by row and told story by story, all of us have things going on, or we have friends impacted by stuff, and life can be hard for us. I don't know if you remember that game at the arcade or Dave & Buster's called Whack-A-Mole. For whatever reason, I used to like playing that stupid game. You remember you get that big old rubber mallet, and then these moles would pop up through a hole, and you'd whack the mole on the head. You get points for it. And that mole would go down, another mole would whack up, and you'd have a few seconds to hit him on the head. And then if you got any good at this game, it just went faster. I mean, you're just whacking all over the place. Well, those games have kind of phased out, but you can now get an app on your phone to do this. Here, you can just keep playing this. I got to tell you, it's not nearly as much fun as the mallet thing was, where you were actually physically pounding the heck out of that table. And then someone reaches under somehow your life and turns up the speed. So no matter how hard you're hitting these moles, they keep popping up. Isn't that how it works? Stuff just comes up, and you whack one mole down, and another thing comes up, and you whack that mole down. And pretty soon, there's this big ugly mole that no matter how hard you hit him in the head, he just stares at you and like snot drooling out of his nose, like. And big deal stuff goes on in our lives. We started this series a couple of weeks ago. It's not over. Coming back from some of the tough stuff in our lives. And Ramin kicked us off talking about the regrets we have. And then last week I talked about loss, particularly the loss of a loved one. And this week we want to talk about addiction issues because those are a big deal. And next week rejection. And last week about when our homes come apart. And coming back from some of those things, it feels like we just can't keep up with all the moles that are popping up in our lives. Ramin started with telling about Lazarus' story, and I suppose there's no greater comeback story than Lazarus. I mean, you know, he was dead, now he's back. Can you imagine what it was like for Lazarus when he went to parties and people saying, oh, last week we went to Hawaii, and somebody else, well, we flew to Paris. Yeah, I was dead, I'm back. I mean, it was like a big deal thing, right? I mean, that would have been like very cool. He topped every story in the room, and I don't want to revisit that story. Ramin did a great job of unpacking it, but I want to just look at those last couple of verses again of what happens, because I think what happened in the Lazarus story is actually what God is wanting to do in our stories. John chapter 11, let me start down in verse 43. And Jesus called in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. And the dead man came out, his hands and his feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. And Jesus said to the people gathered, take off the grave clothes and let him go. Now you remember the story, right? Lazarus, Jesus' friend, has died. He's been in this grave for 4 days. And Jesus comes, and he's grieving, he's heartbroken. And he comes to the grave, and he raises Lazarus from the dead. I mean, that's a big deal story. And there's a lot of things I like about that story. Here, Lazarus was powerless to do anything. He's in the grave. It is over. Last breath, been gone now several days. He can't fix his situation. And Jesus speaks his name, calls him out of that grave, calls him out of darkness, calls him out of hopelessness, calls him to life. Now, I love that that's exactly the story of the Bible about what God wants to do in your life and my life. He invites us out of the graves we have dug somehow for ourselves. But there's another part of the story here I like, and that's when Jesus says to the people gathered around him, hey, help Lazarus get out of those grave clothes. Because here would have been the ceremonial, traditional thing, the custom of the day. When someone died, they would take cloths of linen strips, and they would wrap them in these linen cloths, and they would pack the linen with perfume and spices, and they did it for several reasons. Some of it was a bit related to health reasons. Some of it was because there was no way to embalm or anything. Things just wouldn't smell right. And then they would take the body and they would place it into a grave. They would sometimes carve out in just a rock wall, a rough-hewn space, or they would find a small cave or indentation, and they would place the body in there. And then they would roll a stone in front of the grave, and they did it for several reasons. One was security. Second was to keep any animals from there. And then often, because most people wouldn't have had the resources to do this, so there would have been no private burial place, they would have waited till the body would have decayed, and then they would have moved the stone out of the way, gone back in, collected the bones, placed them in a small box, and then buried them somewhere, usually in a cave dwelling of some place. And so here comes Lazarus, prepped for burial, and he comes out of this grave, and he's got all the grave clothes on him. And Jesus says, help him get the stink of death off of him. Help him get out of those clothes that are trapping him in this grave. Help remind him he's not living in this cemetery anymore. Help remind him that he's not anchored to this grave anymore. I've called him out of that grave. And that's exactly what I think God invites us to do, to help each other. To help us be reminded that we don't have the stink of death on us. We can get past our past. We're not anchored 1 foot back to that grave. That God has called us out of that stuff. And there is some freedom. And when we are powerless to do anything on our own, God steps in to our situations. And I wonder how Lazarus lived after this. I don't know, every time he walked by that place, did he like, hey! I bet, can you imagine the confidence he lived with? Can you imagine? I think we are invited to live like Lazarus did. Now, Lazarus was going to die again. This wasn't just an issue about physical death. Lazarus, though, had been in the grave, and now he is out. And God calls us out of our graves, out of the things that keep us chained to that cemetery, that graveyard we've dug for ourselves somehow, that hole that we've been buried in. God's inviting us out of that. Addiction issues are real issues. There's stuff that gets a hold of our lives, and so many of us get impacted by that. There's not a single person in the room that isn't impacted by addiction issues, either someone in your family or a friend, or maybe you are in a situation right now where something that started out as something you could manage and control now has control of you. The theologian Zwingli said this: if you possess something you cannot give up, you don't possess it, it possesses you. And there are a whole bunch of us that have been possessed. Last week I told you I was going to breakfast with Diane last Saturday morning, and we were in different cars, but I was on Hover. I got to Hover and 17th. I was at the traffic light, and then we started up. And when we started driving, all of a sudden I'm driving over some chunks of mud, just big piles of mud, and I thought, well, some dump truck must have come through here earlier. And then the cars in front of me just started like moving over a lane and trying to get out of the way, and all of a sudden I realized why. There was mud just shooting in the air and was coming back. And some guy had been out mudding in his big old Jeep, had a big old monster truck tire things on him, those compensation tires you get, and sorry, that just slipped. That wasn't even planned. And mud is just slinging off of this Jeep, and I'm now the car getting plastered with this mud, and I can't get over because there's cars next to me, and I'm trying to stay back, and the mud just gets. He's driving faster, and the mud is flying, and now I'm not exactly like happy about this. So we get past Mountain View, and he moved over to the right lane, which gave me an opportunity to get up near him. And I was looking over, trying to politely encourage him to get his Jeep off the road, kind of thing. Or did he? And I don't know. I don't know if he didn't know, or if he didn't care, or if somehow he wouldn't or couldn't stop. But mud was flying everywhere. And those of you who've been in the journey, you get that. Sometimes you're driving the Jeep, mud flying everywhere, and you just somehow can't stop. His girlfriend or his wife was in the passenger seat, and she clearly was embarrassed by this because she was like looking down as people were honking and waving. And some of you have been riding in that Jeep. Embarrassed by what somebody you care about's doing, you can't fix it. You see the mud. And some of you are getting splattered by the mud. 20 to 30% of people in the U.S. adults have an addiction issue related to alcohol or some kind of substance abuse. 60 million people, gambling is their addiction. 40 million, some kind of sexual addiction, pornography or other kind. Eating disorders and all kinds of stuff that grabs a hold of our lives that starts out somehow manageable for us, then gets to the place where it is unmanageable, and there is mud flying everywhere, and we can't stop. whenever we do a message like this, and I know what happens, some of us are sitting out here going, well, that's not me today. That's not me. Do you ever stay up late when you know you need sleep? Does your anger ever get the best of you and you kind of just set off like a flash, temper tantrums? Do you eat more than you should or drink more than you should? Do you skip exercise when you know it would be good for you? Do you have excessive worries or fears? Do you sleep too much or too little? Do you feel stressed out a lot of the time? Do you procrastinate or do you work too much? Do you know the right thing to do, but you choose not to do it? Do you sit for hours in front of a television or camped on your phone with social media? Do you do stuff that you know is wrong, but you do it anyways? If you do any of those things with a desire not to do those things, then welcome to humanity, because all of us get challenged by stuff. We do stuff we don't want to do. The writer of Proverbs, Solomon, says this: there's a way that seems right to us, but in its end it leads to death. And he's not just talking about physical death, he's talking about death of relationships, death of ourselves, death of dreams, all the things that happen when we get in a place where we're doing things that somehow we can't stop ourselves from doing. If I'm going to quit defeating myself, I have to quit deceiving myself. And the first step toward me finding any kind of healing in my life is to remind myself that I need help. That if I could have fixed this on my own, I would have by now. That if somehow I could have made this work, I would. But I'm somehow powerless. I have a tendency to do the wrong thing and my life gets unmanageable. I often blow it. I can't control myself. I need help. And I go through this pattern. I make this choice. I do this thing that I tell myself I'm not going to do. And then all of a sudden I get tripped up. And when I kind of finally come up for air, I promise myself I'm never going to do it again. I feel guilty. I got shame. There's embarrassment. And maybe I go okay for a while, but then all of a sudden I do the same thing again. And here's what happens in that cycle. That hole gets a little deeper and a little deeper and a little deeper until all of a sudden I get to a place when I cannot get out of that hole. How did this happen to us? And whether for you it's a situation that's completely unmanageable, or whether for you there's just some issue in your life that you're continuing to ignore that gets the best of you at times, the reason that happens is because we want to drive our own car. We want to be the captain of our own ship. We want to make our own choices. We want to make life work the way we want to do what we want to do. And in the doing of that, the freedom we want from that almost always leads to some kind of bondage in our lives. Our freedom traps us. I want to be in charge. And instead of lightening the load, I end up with more baggage. Instead of the freedom I thought I wanted to have, I end up with bondage. Instead of finding myself, I often lose myself. I want to control stuff. And what do I want to control? I want to control my image. I want to control how you see me. I want your perception of me to be one that I know you'll be okay with, because I'm afraid that if you knew me, you might reject me. And so I work hard to try to control that, but it gets out of control. I want to control other people, the people around me. I want them to do what I think they should do. I want them to respond in the way I think they should respond. And so we use a lot of things, don't we? Guilt and fear and power and shouting and money and sex and a lot of abuse. There's a lot of things we do to try to control. I want to control my problems. I can handle this. That heartache or hurt from my past, I can handle this. I can make it work. But somehow it just seems to get deeper on us. I'm going to control the pain I feel. I don't like feeling this pain, and so I'm going to numb it somehow. I'm going to run from it somehow. I'm going to avoid it. What I end up doing is masking the pain in my life. And what happens is it leads to other issues I didn't know were going to happen in my life. Several years ago, you know this story, I didn't really want to start exercising, but my doctor encouraged me to do more, and so I started running. I don't really run, I kind of jog. I don't actually jog, I kind of wog, actually. And I've been doing it now long enough, several years, and And here's the deal. While I don't like doing it, I don't get all those great euphoria feelings that people say they get from that stuff, but I know it's good for me. I actually feel better. I've lost some weight. I sleep better. Stress goes down. And so now I want to do it. And I've got this stupid plantar fasciitis thing going on in my foot. And who named that, first of all? Plantar fasciitis. Why couldn't it be like, man, my heel hurts? I mean, that would be like more. And so I've been trying to like manage it, right? And so I've been doing the stuff you're supposed to do, the stretching and the ice and the heat and don't snore and all the other things you're supposed to do to somehow fix this. And it just bothers me. And here's the weird thing. I can run and it's fine, but afterwards it just is, it's incredibly painful. And please don't, on the way out of the service, I promise, I know yours is okay. I don't need all your little home. If you just take honey and melt it on a spoon and pour it in your left ear, it really does work, I promise. I'm good with that. But my heel hurts. And so here's what's happened. It actually has altered how I walk some, which now my knee has been bothering me. And then walking funny like that now has me running slightly different, so now my hip hurts. Because here's the deal. I've been compensating for something in my foot, this pain. I've been masking it. I've been trying to live around it. And now I'm messing up other parts of my life. You been there on this? Diane said to me the other day, hey, you're kind of walking with a limp, and I don't know if you even notice. And here's the deal. We all walk with a limp. All of us have something. Something that we don't want to do, that we do, or we do want to do, and we don't. If I could have fixed this by now, on my own, I would have. And what are the consequences of that? Fear. Fear somebody's going to find me out. Fear they're going to notice somehow. Fear that I'm going to get caught. Fear that I'll find me out, that I really can't fix this. Frustration. And it's frustrating, isn't it, to try to manage the stuff in our lives, to whack all those moles down. Fatigue, it's tiring to play God. Wears us out. Failure that comes with that. I love how David described this spot we get in. When I kept silent, he says in the Psalms, my bones wasted away through my groaning all day long, for day and night your hand was heavy on me, and my strength was sapped as in the heat of summer. And then I acknowledged my sin to you, and I did not cover up my iniquity. I said, I will confess my transgressions to the Lord, and you forgave the guilt of my sin. Because isn't that one of the big powerful issues in our lives, that guilt and shame that comes? Man, why did I do this? How did I get here again? The U.S. has a conscience fund. I don't know if you know about it. Since 1811, if you feel guilty about some way that you've cheated somebody, or particularly the government, you can send this money in to the conscience fund. They get about $45,000 a year comes in on average, over $5.7 million in this fund. Congress and Senate don't know what to do with the fund because they say it's guilt money and they're sure not how to spend it. Like that should bother a politician. I don't understand that, but the smallest gift they ever got was 3 cents back in the 1900s. Somebody said they had used a stamp twice, and it didn't get stamped the first time, and so they used it again. They felt bad about that. A couple years ago, they got a letter from a guy saying, I've been having trouble sleeping at night because I cheated on my taxes last year. Here's $1,000. If I still have trouble sleeping, I'll send the rest. I thought that was awesome. Guilt is powerful. And there was a while in my life that I thought guilt could help me change my behavior, but it can't, actually. Guilt can cause me for a period of time to alter my behavior. Guilt causes me to go, man, I don't want to do that again. But it never lasts long. Guilt can alter my behavior. Only grace can change my behavior. I don't have the ability to do this on my own, because if I could have, I would have by now. And so the solution is to admit I am somehow powerless. I'm powerless to change my past, the hurts, heartaches, and disappointments from the past. I can't fix those. I can't change those. I'm powerless to control other people. I'm responsible for my own actions. I can't do theirs. And I am sometimes powerless to cope with this issue, this mole. Willpower isn't enough. The Apostle Paul said it like this: I do not understand what I do. For what I want to do, I do not do. And what I hate, I do. We all need help. Jesus said, you shall know the truth, and the truth will do what? Set you free. What does it free us from? Here's what Jesus is saying. God's big T truth, it is going to set you free from the sin and disappointment that has cut you off from God. It'll free you from the big T truth of God. It's going to free you from the guilt and shame you've been carrying. That big T truth is going to free you from that grave that you've been anchored to. That big T truth of God is going to free your life in a way so you can find peace and promise in Him. That big T truth of His will fix that hole in your heart. That big T truth of God, what does it free us from? All the little T truths you and I have been living with to somehow excuse our behavior, to make excuses for why we do what we do, to compensate for why we limp. Those little T truths that we've convinced ourselves, this makes my life better, it makes my life manageable, it helps me with my pain, it gets me past my heartache. That little T truth that convinces me that while I don't like my behavior, I just can't help myself. Jesus is saying, you want to be free from that? Then discover that big T truth of God in your life, because it will set you free from that. That's what He's inviting me to know freedom and hope and promise through Him. And so I admit I have a problem, and I recognize that maybe there is a source greater than me that can help me, because I can't do this on my own. And maybe there are some others who can come alongside me to help me manage this, to get past this. That's why millions and millions and millions of people are in recovery groups today, journeying with some others who recognize the stuff and can help hold you accountable. And I know there are a whole bunch of us in the room that are in some place of sobriety today. And I get that part of any of AA groups or SA groups or the number of recovery groups, anonymity is a big deal in those things, because the real reason is they don't want a spokesperson for their group, and it's okay to have that issue and work past it. And I'm not sure if this is okay to do this morning or not, but I know a number of you, you're either one day in sobriety or maybe 50 years in sobriety. But if you are, I want to invite you just to stand for a second, if you would. And I know you don't have to, but if you would, if you're somewhere in sobriety today, would you stand for a second? The power and courage that these people have to deal with their sobriety one day at a time is a lot of hard work. And I want to congratulate you on wherever you are in this spot. Because God is inviting us to get past the stuff in our lives that we cannot fix on our own. And it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of work for us. And sometimes we can barely get ourselves off the floor. But I love what Jill Briscoe said. I never knew that God lived so close to the floor. He's inviting us to remove the stink of death from us. Charles Swindoll says the files of heaven are filled with stories of redeemed, refitted renegades and rebels. We've all been rescued from things we've been ashamed of. There's not a single saint in a single church who wasn't taken from some dunghill. And so we all fight the same fight with the filth of our flesh, regardless of how loudly we sing, how piously we pray, or how sweetly we say hello. We all walk with a limp. And God wants to do a new thing. Isaiah said it like this: forget the former things. Don't dwell on the past. See, I'm doing a new thing. How it springs up, do you not receive it? I'm making a way in the desert and streams in the wasteland. God wants to bring refreshment and hope to our souls. All of us can come out of the grave.